Did Daniel Dubois deserve to win Knockout of the Year at the Ring Magazine Awards for his stoppage over Anthony Joshua? In this video, I'm going to dissect and analyse some of the other contenders for the award before I try and figure out whether or not I think that should have been given as Knockout of the Year. A little bit of a different one today, guys, in that I'm joined by someone who is an absolute expert in the art of the knockout. Somebody who is a renowned and prestigious voice in the sport of boxing. So stick around to the end of this one, guys, as we try and figure out for you who should have won Knockout of the Year. Hello everyone, welcome back to A Guy Called Henry. Guys, just a couple of quick things before we get into this one. Before I introduce my guest, I have to say and apologise, the audio quality on mine in this video isn't the best, and that is because my microphone broke literally 2 minutes before I was about to start the interview. But luckily for you guys, it's less of me talking than usual and a little bit more of our guest. And the guest today is Mr. Andy Clarke. Andy Clarke is the chief commentator for Sky Sports Boxing. He's the author of the award-winning book, The Knockout. I think it's like #1 in the charts for books of boxing books on Amazon. It's an absolutely fantastic read, so I highly recommend you go and get your hands on it. I'll put some links in the description for that. He's also a panelist on the award-winning podcast, The Boxing Show, which is one of my absolute favourites with Rob Tebbett and Barry Jones. Really, really good stuff. This conversation was absolutely fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed it. We worked our way through the other contenders for Knockout of the Year. We're going to have footage in there. It's going to be very, very engaging, guys. So please watch the whole thing. Stick around to the end. Get your comments in the comments section below. Who do you think should have won Knockout of the Year? Please subscribe to A Guy Called Henry and bang a like on the video. Without further ado, I'm going to get you into it. I hope you enjoy. Cheers, guys. Andy, how you doing?
Good. Very well. You?
Excellent. Very good, thank you. We're obviously fresh off the back of those Ring Magazine Awards. I wondered what you made of the whole spectacle. Did you get a chance to take a look at the show at all?
I didn't see too much of it because I was in Sheffield with Sky. I was invited actually, but I couldn't make it because I was working on that Sky show. I've been recruited by the Ring to do some podcasts. I started that just before Christmas. Did a sit down with a load of people. Usyk Fury week. The first one that they released was last week with Jai Opataya. It was really good fun, so I'm looking forward to getting cracking on that next year. But the awards look spectacular. I mean, the amount of people they managed to get there didn't surprise me, but I think it was put together pretty quickly. So it was a real who's who. I saw somebody saying on social media that the idea is that it will be like a Ballon d'Or for boxing, which is a great idea actually. It's a really good idea, and I think they're capable of pulling it off because the ring has always commanded, the ring champion and the ring belt has always commanded a lot of respect because it's something that you look at the list of people who've held it and you look at their rankings down the years and they stand up and they always have. So I think it's something that if anybody's going to do it and be taken seriously enough for people to, you know, what sports fans are like, for people to tolerate it, I think it is them, because as we know in boxing we don't have an overall sanctioning body or governing body who decides on everything, and I suppose you could have 4 individual award ceremonies with the WBC, WBA, IBF and WBO, but in a sense what would really be the point of that? And I guess they have their conventions where they kind of do that to an extent.
Yeah. It's I think it's really interesting, and I think the great thing about it is it's getting everybody in the same room, which never happens in boxing, really, with all the different... I mean, it's happening more now, but I think, you know, in business and in life, it so often happens that all it takes is to get 2 people in the same place. There was always the story about how Mayweather-Pacquiao got made, I remember, where there was some guy who knew both of them, and then I think he got paid some intermediary money or something. He was like a mate of Pacquiao's. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I feel like with an event like that, you get everybody in the same room. I do actually think it will lead to fights getting made in the future and things like that, because people are just not around each other otherwise. So I think it's a good thing.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. When people see each other face to face, their preconceptions and their potential animosities that don't really come from anywhere, that aren't really real, they can get eroded very, very quickly. Frank and Eddie have found that when they finally met each other and were kind of forced into a space with each other, that, you know, they thought, actually, you know what, this is okay, this is fine, and it is good. It is good to get everybody together, because I remember talking to Bob Arum about this, and he said that the problem is now is that people just fire shots on social media, whereas before, to get anything done, okay, you could do it with a telephone call, but generally speaking, people would end up doing it face to face. And he said that back then the word he used was collegiality. There was a lot more collegiality, and he says there just isn't really that now, and you can get the wrong idea about somebody via a social media message, and they can be quite different people online to how they actually are in real life. I never really see the point of that, but people do that. You meet them and you think, wow, actually you're quite abrasive online, but in person you're actually quite reasonable.
There's quite a few of them. There's quite a few of them out there, yeah.
Yeah, there's loads. There's loads. I find it strange, but there's plenty. So yeah, getting everybody in the same room is always a good thing. And fighters have always got that common bond anyway. And anyone in the same job, in the same industry, you've always got something to talk about. And you'll know someone who'll know the other person that apparently you despise and who despises you, but that person has got you both in common. And that person likes you both, so that's something to start with, isn't it? And you can get somewhere then, possibly.
Exactly. Look, the reason we're doing this, for those that don't know, I've said it in my intro, but Andy is the author of the book The Knockout, and for a while now, I've wanted to do a video of Andy where we look at some knockouts, because I read the book, and he's got a very, very good perspective on the knockout now. It's sort of, there's another level that you can go to when you dissect a knockout, when you've kind of done the work that Andy's done to understand what's actually happening when someone gets knocked out, and that is from the actual science of what's happening to the psychology that is required to administer one in the first place. And last night at the Ring Magazine Awards, Daniel Dubois was awarded Knockout of the Year for his finish over Anthony Joshua, which was obviously a great event, a really good finish. But it did lead me to sort of think, was that actually Knockout of the Year? So what we've done is we've pulled up a few other knockouts from the DAZN, in particular DAZN knockouts for 2024 video, to sort of analyse them and see if we think that maybe there's another contender in here for Knockout of the Year that maybe should have won the award. So we'll just go through them, Andy, and I'm just going to reel them off to you, and I'm going to get your insight, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. It's always interesting to have a good variety of knockouts, because different things are happening, and there'll be plenty that people think of also watching this and wonder why we haven't included them. There are loads. There are a lot more knockouts than people think there are. We tend to think that they're very, very rare. Stoppages and knockouts, not the same thing, not in my opinion. And knockouts can come in lots of different forms. So we've kind of picked out a few which are all quite different, because that's easy. It's an easy way to get your teeth into it. But there will be loads that people have seen. There's plenty that I've seen that we're not going to do, basically because we need the footage, but don't we really?
That's the footage. Key. Yeah. So if anyone's got anything that they think we should get in the comments below and spam it. But as you say, variety is the spice of life. So go for it. But the first one I've put in, and it's actually an interesting one to talk about first, because it's Joshua and Ngannou. Now, obviously, Anthony Joshua was on the receiving end of that Daniel Dubois shot that completely iced him. But earlier in the year, everyone thought, God, we've got a new Anthony Joshua here, a counter-punching Anthony Joshua, one who has kind of gone through the fire in his career and has psychologically rebuilt himself to this point now where, whilst the opposition was not the highest level, he seemed to have turned a corner, and he went and administered an absolutely unbelievable knockout. So, Andy, I'd love to hear your thoughts and reaction to that, and should that have been sort of in contention?
Yeah, 100%. It's the one I would pick myself. When I've been asked what my knockout of the year was, it's been this one, because of the delivery of it, the cleanness of it, and the fact that he was knocked out cold. He was knocked unconscious for a period of time, and that sounds like a sadistic thing to say, but that's what a knockout is. They can come in different forms. Strictly speaking, in the UK, for a knockout to be recorded, you have to be counted out. The referee has to reach the full count, and then it's recorded as a knockout. If they suspend the count or the towel comes in, then in this country it'll be recorded as a TKO, but obviously that really is a knockout. So somebody could get knocked out cold and the referee doesn't bother counting. Here that'll go down as a TKO. In America it won't. In certain states anyway it won't. In Nevada, for example, if you waive the count because somebody's out, like what happened with Ricky Hatton against Manny Pacquiao, then it will still be recorded as a knockout. And the reason I picked this one is because Anthony Joshua quite simply knocked Francis Ngannou unconscious. We'll talk about Dubois Joshua. That was different because it was a tremendous punch, but Joshua wasn't knocked unconscious. It was a knockout because he couldn't manage to beat the count. But with this one, and I was there for this one, I was there for both of them actually, but it was clinical and utterly merciless, because he put him down in the first round and then he put him down in the second round, and at that point Ngannou gets back to his feet. He doesn't, I wouldn't say, really know exactly what is going on. He's got enough control of his body that he's able to get back to his feet, and you knew what was coming next, and the referee would have known what was coming next. But you can't stop a fight at that point. Some people would look at it and think, well, if you know what's coming next, you have to stop the fight, don't you? No, I don't think you do. Sometimes a knockout is a natural conclusion to a fight, and boxing without knockouts would be nothing like the spectacle it is, and people just wouldn't watch it in the way that they do. And Joshua just measured him. He was very, as I say, clinical about it. I've spoken to him about it actually, and it was one of those situations where he knew he just needed to get the delivery of that right hand correct, get his feet in the right place. He almost measured it out in his head, and he stepped in and he swung that right hand, and Ngannou couldn't do a single thing about it. And you see his legs collapse underneath him, and he's unconscious before he hits the floor. And then he's just, it's like he's been poured onto the canvas, because that's what happens. You get knocked out, you get switched off, and all of that tensile strength just leaves your body. And that's why you see fighters nestle in this almost absurd symmetry. It's what Amir Khan did against Canelo. It's what Ricky did against Manny Pacquiao, where they end up just lying flat on their back, legs out straight, arms by their side, like they're asleep. Literally, like it's the most peaceful, serene thing you would see in your life, because it's almost like gravity and this centrifugal force takes over, and that's how you assemble. It's a wild thing to see, because it's precipitated by an act of what looks like fairly, or can at times look like fairly frenetic violence, and then you've just got this utter stillness. And that's why, for me, it was my knockout of the year, because he knocked him out. You know, he knocked him out cold. And it never gets old. It's worrying when you see it, because you're looking at Ngannou there, and in those moments he could be dead. And you know, you just take it down a notch if you do what I do. But when you see someone do that, it is absolutely spectacular.
By the way, people should stick around to the end, because we're not guaranteeing that is still Andy's pick for knockout of the year. But I was going to say, yeah, I love the way you described that, the way he was poured onto the canvas, because it was a bit like that. It was almost like the way his body from part to part sort of landed and was completely out. And it's so true, you know, the way you see these absolutely, I mean, when you're as big as Ngannou is as well, it's even more dramatic to see someone like that laid out on the canvas, unable to move. It's, yeah, and you see the size of the man, you see the kicks he's taken to his head in MMA and things like that, and you sort of think, is it possible to actually put a dent in someone like that? So it is all the more spectacular of a knockout. I suppose it depends how you judge knockout of the year, but I suppose the one thing against it would be that it was his second professional boxing match, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at context and stuff like that, then yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's still a big stage, and you would expect someone like Joshua to be able to do something like that to somebody in their second pro fight. But, you know, he did what he did against Fury, Francis Ngannou. And people can say what they like about Fury not having trained properly and all the rest of it. It is something that happened in real life. He went 10 rounds with the then best heavyweight in the world. So you can't take away from what Joshua did there. But in terms of what you were just saying there about Ngannou and the kind of specimen he is, and the fires he'd been through in MMA, that will make it a really hard one to get past, because that's something about knockouts that's really interesting too, is how do you recover from it? Because he would never have imagined that somebody could do that to him. There is no universe in which Francis Ngannou thought that was possible, that somebody could do that to him. And when they're that big, when they're heavyweights, and you see somebody who looks absolutely invincible making their way to the ring, all of a sudden, a few minutes later, stretched out in the most vulnerable state you'll ever see anybody. It's it's wild.
I always hear you on the boxing show talking about, you know, how does a fighter explain a loss to themselves? They need to have something that they can use to explain a loss, so that they can maintain this sort of idea in their minds that they are unbeatable, and it's that sort of delusion that we always talk about boxers needing. And I heard him on Joe Rogan actually after the knockout being interviewed. I don't know if you saw it, but Ngannou was sort of saying all this stuff about how Joshua's team, made him get to the venue late, and they kind of played games with him and tricks them. There was a couple other things that he said about he felt weird before. He said he thought maybe the water he was drinking something wasn't right, or and it is we can't imagine it, they can't imagine it, and they have to have a way of explaining it to themselves. But also I just wanted to say that the context of that fight was, as a fan, was so interesting, because I felt that Joshua really needed that knockout for the narrative of his career. That sort of statement, absolutely brutal knockout, just to be on his resume for his highlight reel, to sort of go, right, this guy's rebuilt, he's ready. And that's why, and we'll talk about it at the end, the Dubois knockout, and sort of assess if we think that's still the winner, but that's why that was such an interesting moment as well, because it was sort of like that ultimate high to that ultimate low in such a short amount of time. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think he did. He'd been getting there because he had one against Helenius, but he'd been a bit tentative and waited until he was really kind of ready to go, and then he just beat the shit out of Otto Wallin, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
and the knockout was on the way, but Joey Gamache in the corner did exactly the right thing with Wallin. That was when you stop a fight, and he stopped the fight. He stopped the fight. But then Joshua cleaning Ngannou out was exactly what he needed at that point. And you talk about the reasons that Francis was coming up with. Deontay Wilder did the same thing after his second fight with Tyson Fury. You're desperately searching for something, because the simple explanation of I could not prevent my opponent doing something like that to me is no good. And the idea of trying to shrug it off as, well, he was just better than me on the night, that doesn't work either. Not if you're him, in the way that it didn't work for Ricky Hatton when he got knocked out by Mayweather. That was the more damaging one than Pacquiao, really, for him, because he was undefeated at that point. And again, he would never have imagined that somebody could do that to him. He never would have imagined it. And he'd been knocked out in the amateurs, Ricky, by Jürgen Bremer, which seems mental, because Jürgen Bremer went on to become a light heavyweight. But fighters will kind of accept. They all say that you need to have that acceptance that this could happen to you, because if you don't have that, then you're in trouble. So he did have that, Ricky, but as his career progressed, he would have got to the point, I'm sure, where he thought, listen, I could definitely lose, close fight, points, whatever. I could lose, yeah, of course. I'm immortal. But he would have got to the point, I think, that in his own mind, he'd been at the top for that long that nobody would be able to do that to him. And Ngannou, with all that wealth of experience in MMA, it would never have crossed his mind that that was possible, unless there was something wrong with the water, or there's got to be another reason. There's got to be another reason. It cannot be that my opponent is just that much better and too good for me.
We should move on to the next knockout. The next one we've got, and it's quite an interesting one, because you've made the distinction at the beginning between sort of a KO, a TKO, whatever the other methods are. We've got Wardley Clarke 2, and obviously to watch this was hard. It was actually really hard to look at, for me anyway. When it happened, I was like, it's just that he comes away, Wardley, from landing the shot. Clarke's on his knee on the ropes, and you can physically see there's a dent in the side of his head. What did you make of it, and how do you put that into the sort of conversation?
Yeah, I was there for that one as well, and after the first fight, we were expecting it to go deep again and be another, grueler, basically. But that's boxing, isn't it? And that's heavyweight boxing in particular. You never really know. And he got him going, and then Fabio's got this way of locking on. He throws these big, wide shots that are difficult to pick up. They kind of appear on the radar quite late. And Fraser was in trouble, but it didn't look like it was impossible that he might be able to get through it. And then he was caught by that right hand, and he ended up kind of half sitting in the ropes. And you looked at his face, and his jaw was just a little bit displaced, and you could see the dent in the side of his head. And I think Matt Macklin next to me said that he looks like he's had a stroke, which was a kind of brilliant description, actually, to come up with right in the spur of the moment. And I was looking at him just thinking, there's got to be a fracture there, given the damage there is. It wasn't really around the eye socket. It was a bit further along towards the ear. And I'm not a doctor, so I don't like to kind of immediately try and diagnose an injury. It's quite a popular thing to do these days, but it's not, unless you really know, then people can see, they can see that there's something really, really wrong. And in that situation, you are just really concerned that there could be something terribly wrong. Because at that point, in his head, he looked at the expression on his face, and what I was thinking to myself was, what is going on in his brain at the moment? As in, is there a really big problem here? Because there could be, because I'd not really seen something like that before. And as it turned out, he was okay. I know the doctor, Neil Scott, who is the chief medical officer for the board, who was there that night and has been ringside for most of the brutal knockouts I've seen recently, and they had to get to work on him. They basically had to kind of go in through the cheek and lift that bone up, the cheekbone, and reset it. And he's going to come back, Fraser, but mentally, again, that will be a hard one to get past. He wasn't knocked unconscious, but he just had serious damage inflicted on him. And in a way, when you feel that happen and you are conscious, I think in a way it's almost worse because you're aware of it. He'll remember that. When someone gets knocked out cold like Ngannou, he won't remember it. Ricky doesn't remember getting knocked out by Pacquiao. People sometimes after the event claim that they do remember it, but they don't. Those are memories that are inserted.
I remember you talking about that.
Yeah, those are memories that are inserted after the event. Because if you get knocked out cold, it's absolutely impossible that you can remember it. But Fraser will remember that. At some point, I'm going to talk to him about it. But because I'm fascinated to know what he does remember. Yeah. Different kind of a one.
Yeah, and with that one as well, I guess the pain levels must have been... Because often they say... I hear fighters say all the time that getting knocked out doesn't really hurt. And, I think the pain levels must have been on another planet, having a broken bone in your face from a punch like that. I mean, of all the knockouts on this list, it's probably... Or stoppages, we should say, on this list, it probably is the most damaging one.
I'd say it's probably the most, in a way, it's the most shocking one. It's that visual of his jaw just slightly displaced and a dent in the side of his head. That is really, really serious stuff. And when something like that happens, I think it's just the pure alarm of that something is badly wrong because you might have heard it. It'll make a noise, I'd imagine. I remember Kell Brook describing getting his eye socket broken by Golovkin and then Errol Spence, as it sounded like when you're cracking a lobster shell. He said it kind of like sounded a bit like that. And it was
That's horrible.
And inside his head, it was like almost like a bit of a kind of, it felt like a little bit of a sucking feeling almost. He's trying to describe it, and you just think, wow. So you're aware of it. You feel it, you hear it, you're experiencing it. Daniel Dubois had the same thing against Joe Joyce, and when he took his knee, I think it was just pure confusion and kind of fear really of what's just happened. So that is, it was a wild scene, and it came so early as well. It caught everybody completely by surprise.
As I say, we'll kind of make an estimation at the end of what we think should be the winner, but we'll go on to one that's a little bit different, which is the Bam Estrada stoppage, which was a body shot. So a slightly different one. I know you didn't really do body shots in the book. We were mentioning, you were talking about just before we started. But what did you make of that one, Andy?
Well, those body shots are absolutely savage, aren't they? We had a few last night. I was working on a show for Sky, and Sam Hickey put Lewis Howes away with 3 left hands to the body, and I was talking to Matt Macklin about it, and he got eviscerated by Triple G, by Gennady Golovkin, with a left hand to the floating rib. That was as bad as it gets. And Macklin is just when he was a fighter, he was really, really hard.
I remember the way he rolled. I remember the way he rolled over on the canvas.
He was as tough as you could be. And I'm not just saying that because he's my friend. Anyone would say that about him. He was as tough as you could be. And he actually kind of just screamed out in pain and looked like he was being tasered, basically. Because what happens is the floating rib just goes... it's called the floating rib, not because it's literally floating, but because that one's just attached to the sternum. It doesn't have that kind of double attachment that the other ribs have. And that just goes clattering into your liver. That's what happens. And you can imagine how painful that is. And that's why you get that short circuit of a fighter being in absolutely excruciating pain. And then not that long afterwards, they seem like they're kind of okay. But if you can't beat the 10 count, then you get knocked out. And that's what's really interesting about body shots. It's that kind of short circuit that you recover from quite quickly. You're never unconscious, but you are incapable. It renders you incapable for long enough that you get knocked out. And yeah, like I said, I didn't do it in the book because I was concentrating on the loss of consciousness was what I was thinking about more.
Physiologically quite different, right?
Yeah, they're completely different. Yeah, but it is. Yeah. I mean, it's a very particular type of pain. If you speak to someone who's actually been on the end of it, not that I have or ever will be, but and it looks like it. There's no hiding it. They sometimes manage to hide it for a couple of seconds. The pain doesn't hit immediately in a lot of cases, and then you'll see them take a bit of a step back. They'll maybe just their knees will dip slightly, and then they'll go down. Maybe touch down, put a glove on the canvas, take the count, get back up. But once you've gone down from one, you've got a problem then.
And I think the thing that's so frustrating for them with fighters as well is if you ask them 30 seconds later, they're all right. Like they could have kept going, and that's sort of the beauty of a body shot stoppage. It's for that moment you're incapacitated, you can't do anything, but it comes back again so fast. So they must be the most frustrating way to get stopped, I think, because it's so quickly again afterwards you could have continued. And I guess that probably helps to fuel the illusion, right, that you could have won.
Yeah, I mean it is just that. I think it would be really frustrating, but you're just rendered incapable of continuing for just about the right amount of time, and there's really nothing you can do about it. I mean, it would be incredibly frustrating, but it's a very skillful punch to be able to deliver, and really it can happen to anyone too, just like a headshot can take anybody out. You know, people talk about chins, and people will talk about somebody having chocolate ribs or being a bit weak to the body, but generally speaking, it can happen to anyone. If you get hit on that square inch almost, you've got to be really accurate with it, but if you get hit exactly right with one of them, then I don't really think there's much you can do. Most fighters I speak to say that. They just say there's not really any way to... You can't strengthen that area. It doesn't really matter how many sit-ups you do or how many times you get whacked with a medicine ball. If you get caught right there as you're coming forward as well, then you've got a big problem.
Definitely. I think as well, just specifically about Bam, he's got really good power for a smaller guy, and I think he's just so complete, isn't he? And just to go along with all those brilliant skills and everything else he's got going for him, he really can whack as well. So, I think important to have a smaller guy in there. And I know we've not got Inoue in the list, but it's always something it captures your imagination when you get a guy in the lower weight classes that can punch. There's something special about it. You had it with Pacquiao.
There absolutely is. You look at what he did to Sonny Edwards. He hurt him really badly early. There was a fracture there. And he systematically beat him up to the point where he just couldn't take it anymore, and the corner pulled him out. And I saw Sonny a few days afterwards, because that was in Arizona, kind of like mid-December, the Christmas before last, and I was in Saudi at the time, and he came out because Lyndon Arthur was on the card. And I spoke to him about it, and I got the feeling that he was probably in that bracket of fighter who was in the process, when I spoke to him, of explaining it to himself.
Right.
And the road he was going down was that the fracture was the key. And of course, you can get hit with all sorts of punches, and for one to result in a fracture, you can regard yourself as slightly unlucky, I think, because you have to get hit a very particular way for that to happen. And from that point onwards, he didn't really have much of a chance, and he showed his toughness by sticking it out for as long as he did. And I thought to myself, that adds up. That could work for you. But I think it left scars. Because I don't think he ever imagined that could happen to him. Because I'd spoken to him about it. He said to me, after he won his title against Thulani, I remember saying we had him on the podcast, me and Matt, and I just said, Sonny, you're a realist, aren't you? You know what this business is. If you're at world level now, if you're going to stay at world level and have 10, 15 fights at world level, you're probably going to lose. That's just what happens. And he said, and particularly the way I fight, it's going to go the distance, close one, I might not get decisions, all that kind of stuff. But I don't think he thought that he could get dismantled in the way that he was by Rodriguez. And I think there was a hangover from it, because when he came back against Curiel, Curiel wasn't that kind of fighter, and he was able to use his feet and get the win. But then when he got in with Galal Yafai, he knew he was in with someone who was going to step to him and who was big and strong and was going to look to try and take him out. And I think that's why mentally he gave up the ghost in that fight quite quickly, because he started to have a few flashbacks, I think, was probably what happened there.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I remember being in the gym with Sonny once, and I remember him saying to me, and he was kind of, being a bit braggadocious, tongue-in-cheek and whatnot, but he sort of said to me, I'd love to get in there with a heavyweight one day and just go missing for 12 rounds. Like, just use my feet. I'm that elusive, essentially. And, I think for that to happen to you, it must have really shattered his illusions of, the fact that, like you say, he probably didn't imagine he was ever going to get hurt that badly in the ring with just how elusive he was in his prime as well. So yeah, that's really interesting. Let's push on. Let's go for the next one, which is Zhang Wilder, which is quite an interesting one because, again, context. It's not. I mean, neither man's at the peak of their powers anymore, but it was quite a dramatic knockout to see Wilder laid out like that.
Yeah, it was. It was. I spoke to him about knockouts in the week building up to this, actually, Wilder, because
is that when you got your interview with him?
Yeah. I didn't get long with him, but he was up for it. He really kind of bought into the idea of the book. Not that I spoke to him about it for very long, but he was was interested in it, and I really wanted to talk to him because he's really interesting. Because until he got stopped by Fury, again, he would never have imagined that what happened to him in that second fight could happen to him. He's the bronze bomber, he's invincible, he throws bombs, all of this kind of stuff. I don't think it would ever have... In his world, that couldn't happen. I don't think he ever had that acceptance that something like that could happen. And then it did happen, and it was a big, big problem. And it took a lot of getting over. But then in that third fight, which I was at against Fury, he came out and seemingly, although he put some weight on, seemingly was the same. There was no fear, and I was so impressed by that. Even though he lost, he didn't. There was no. He wasn't fearful or hesitant. He was still fighting that way that he'd always boxed, which is the ultimate kind of Russian roulette in boxing at heavyweight. Is it's chin or be chinned, and that's what he was. And he always trusted that he would chin his opponent. He could be 7-0 down on the cards or whatever it was against Luis Ortiz, and then you uncork one and it's game over. But he was different that week. I hadn't been around him loads, but he'd started to get into ayahuasca. He'd seemed to become more philosophical. Yeah, he seemed to become more philosophical. He was different. He didn't bring that darkness to fight week anymore. And I remember thinking to myself, for the rest of your life, this is a really good thing. But for boxing, particularly given the kind of fighter you are, this is probably a bit of a disaster.
Yeah, I think I remember hearing you say that. I think it was you that said that. Like,
yeah, and when
I
spoke to him,
that's on the money as a statement.
Yeah, and when I spoke to him during the week, I thought he gave me some great stuff, talking about how you have to have this acceptance that it could happen to you, because whatever I'm trying to do to him, he could do to me. And I thought to myself, you're right about that, but I bet you wouldn't have said that before the second fight against Fury. And I bet if I tried to have this kind of conversation with you, or even suggested to you that getting knocked out was a possibility prior to that fight, how you used to be in fight week, this conversation would have been short and would not have ended very well. I might have bottled it completely and not even tried it, to be honest with you, given what he used to be like. And then against Zhang, he's still searching for that he can't, it just doesn't seem to be able to drop those bombs anymore, does he? And the knockout was bad because he turned his back and then kind of span, and then Zhang caught him.
It was really amateurish.
Yeah, it was. And what it meant was that he wasn't set for the punch. He wasn't braced to take the punch at all. And the key with knockouts is to knock somebody out, you need to catch them with something that they're not braced for. Either because they don't see it, so they're not braced at all, and that's how you get single punch knockouts. Or you vary up the hand speed and the heaviness of shot cleverly. You dress things up, and then you just catch them with something that's heavier than they think it's going to be. So even though they're braced for it, they're not braced enough, and you do some damage. And Wilder, in that case, wasn't braced for it at all because he wasn't even looking. And then as he turned around, he got punched straight in the face by 20-stone Zhilei Zhang. And that's never going to end well, is it? And at that point, it was over. But the dramatic thing about that for me was just seeing someone like Wilder, who I'd watched unable to detonate against Joseph Parker. Got to give Parker huge credit for that. But he was unable to detonate against Parker, once again reduced to that state where this KO artist just didn't seem able to deliver a KO anymore, and he got knocked out. And I looked at that and just thought, wow, it's over, basically. I think we'll see him again. I mean, we've heard rumours about him boxing still again. But I just thought to myself, the greatest knockout artist of our time watching boxing, maybe of all time actually, when you consider how he was able to chin anyone from almost any angle at any time with this ludicrous power, it's over. You know, and that's, you know, I wasn't misty-eyed, but I was looking at it just thinking, God, this is a hard sport. You know, he's done that to so many people, and now it's happening to him, and it's what happens, isn't it?
Wilder's such a confusing fighter to me, because I'm not sure we're ever going to know how good he actually was, because, you know, the last couple of losses he's had to Parker and Zhang, you know, I don't think he ever really had a run in his career of back-to-back opponents that were sort of that top 10 level. It was always guys that were sort of on the outside a little bit. I know he had the Fury fights, but the first one, of course, Fury's coming off that long layoff. He loses the second one, he loses the third one, and probably, I mean, I thought he lost the first one, I think most people did, but was given the draw. I know he absolutely iced Luis Ortiz, another guy where it was kind of hard to say how good he was. I think he was pretty good. But yeah, to have those, to then finally sort of go into a consistent run of different kinds of guys, different fighters who are in the top 10 who can fight and have their own unique styles, and to get beaten that badly, it's really hard to say how good he actually was. And yeah, I don't know, but it was weird. That Zhang knockout was really weird to me. I personally, I think it was one that has to be in the list because it's a good heavyweight knockout, but I found it very strange watching it. I have to say, I really did, just because of the way he turned around. And you know, it wasn't like Zhang had to really set it up or anything. It was just Wilder kind of going, what's just happened to me, spinning around to almost look to the referee or whatever he was trying to do, and then just getting clocked basically. So it was definitely a bit of a strange one. But Andy, let's push on to Lucas Bahdi and Ashton Sylve. Now, these are not fighters that I really know much about, and I hadn't even seen this knockout until I saw it in the video, if I'm being honest with you. So what did you make of this one?
So I did. This is a great one, and often it doesn't matter who the fighters are a lot of the time. If it's at a decent enough level, then a knockout's a knockout, and this is quite a shocking one because he's knocked out by the combination instantly and collapses to the canvas, and again he's been switched off, and all that rigidity has left his body because he's unconscious. The signals from the brain are no longer reaching any other part of his body because the brain function is just it's gone for those few seconds, and he just tombstones straight onto his front. And again his legs are straight, his arms are straight, and he just goes down flat in a similar way to we saw Manny Pacquiao do against Marquez in their fourth fight. You know, it's
that's a good comparison actually.
It's just an amazing thing to see. It's an amazing thing to see. There's a really good one that people should look up from 1995 when it's a fight between Simon Brown and Vincent Petway for the IBF super welterweight title, light middle as they would have called it then. I'm pretty sure anyway. But look up Vincent Petway, Pettway, Simon Brown, because what happens is he gets hit by a shot, Simon Brown, and his legs just kind of come together, his arms drop by their side, and he just goes straight onto his back. So it's the same thing, but obviously Sylve goes onto his front, and Simon Brown goes straight onto his back, and he's laid out neatly arranged as discussed. And then in that unconscious state, he just raises his lead glove and just starts throwing these little jabs. So even though he's spark out, his muscle memory...
He's done so much training.
He's done so much training that his expectation is that in any given situation, he will somehow find a way to try and keep fighting.
Wow. So
check that one out. It's crazy thing to see. It's a crazy thing to see. But it just reminded me of that because the way he goes down is kind of the way that Simon Brown went down, but the other way because Simon Brown went onto his back and Sylve goes down onto his front. And there's something really dramatic about seeing someone, as I say, just getting turned off. And it's really obvious when you see it and it happens so quickly. Like the human body responds to that lack of brain impulse, I guess, neurologists watching this would probably be tut-tutting, but don't
know if there'll be too many of them watching this, Andy, but yeah.
The body goes inert so quickly, and just crashes. You know, he's like, you know, it's like a pillar of salt, isn't it? Just dissolving, and he just goes face first. And I'd not seen that one actually, so you know that really caught my eye.
Bakole Anderson, I think we should talk about that one, because I feel like that was almost Martin Bakole's coming out party a little bit. It's really, really stuck him in the conversation in the heavyweight division. And I think, for me, on a personal point, he is probably the heavyweight that I'm most excited to see in his next fight. I want to see how he consolidates that win. But what did you make of that stoppage of Jared Anderson?
It was a really, really good stoppage. And again, this is interesting because it's different. It's an accumulation knockout, isn't it? An accumulation stoppage. And the reason that Bakole is so dangerous is because he's huge and he's got really heavy hands. But he manages to throw punches without really putting too much effort into it. He never loads up, as we describes it. He just moves his hands. But he gets that little bit of rotation into it. So he can throw lots of punches for someone who's absolutely massive. And you could see that Anderson, right from the beginning, was struggling to keep him off. And that whenever Bakole landed on him, it was doing him damage, and he was chipping away at him, and it was reducing him to a state where almost at any point in the round or the couple of rounds before that, if Bakole had really put his foot down, he could have taken him out. But he knew that he didn't need to do that, because that's taking an undue risk. It's not being conservative, it's just being sensible. He was looking at Anderson, and fighters know when they've got someone really hurt, they stay hurt. And I haven't watched that one closely enough to kind of make up my mind whether I feel like Anderson was concussed. He might have been, but if a fighter gets another fighter concussed, it's a very binary thing. Either you are or you aren't. You can get hit heavily and recover, and we see that, but you can get hit heavily and you don't recover. And concussion doesn't go anywhere. Once it's in there, and you can see it because the fighter... You know, they just lose that little bit of control. It's like they've had too much to drink, was how Froch described it to me. And you saw some of that with Anderson, because he was getting increasingly desperate, and it was only a matter of time. So even though you don't get that spectacular one punch and the kind of visuals we've been discussing in other knockouts, it's just this methodical, brutal... beat down, which a heavyweight is. I mean, it's a painful thing to watch at times.
It is. I find Bakole quite fascinating, and the way you described that is so true. The volume that he's able to box at, and the amount of punches he's able to throw. And I've in my videos where I've done my analysis, I've sort of described it as this sort of rainbow stance that he sort of takes up, where his shoulders are quite hunched, his arms are quite loose, but it creates this kind of sort of rainbow shape. And from that position, he sort of slings his arms, and he will put everything into it. And it's interesting because to get away from that as a fight, it's quite difficult. You know, you either have to take it to the guard, which is pretty uncomfortable, and then he gets himself, and he's actually very good at hopping around his man and creating angles from that position. But also, you know, if you're someone like a Jared Anderson who stays in the pocket a bit too long, likes to move his head, it's quite risky because Bakole really commits to those attacks. And it was just a really Martin Bakole-esque performance, and Anderson just didn't... It was almost like Anderson didn't know what Bakole was going to do when you were watching it. It was a really weird performance from Jared Anderson, I thought, and just much too green for that fight, I thought.
It was a weird match to make. I mean, I think it was probably a match made by... Well, it was a Riyadh season card. I wouldn't have thought that Top Rank really wanted it, to be honest with you.
You think they were forced it? You don't think it was one of their sort of baptism of fire matchmaking?
Yeah, I think he probably got made an offer, or they got made an offer to put to him that was too good for him to say no to, and they would have understood why he wanted to take the fight. But I don't think that the Top Rank matchmakers would have made that match myself. I mean, they're rehabilitating him now, Anderson, and it won't be easy because... He was been given the big build-up. He kind of misfired a little bit in a couple of fights before that. I think he might have a little bit of a kind of... My theory with him is that he's maybe a little bit afraid of success, because this happens with people sometimes. They realise that there's a lot riding on them, there's a lot invested in them, there's a lot expected of them, and all of a sudden they can go off the rails slightly because it's an excuse to fall short. You know, it's because the pressure at that level is intense. that you put on yourself and that other people put on you. And that was a really, really hard fight for him to take. And he couldn't keep him off, could he? If you're going to beat Bakole, you've got to be able to hurt him. And you need to do it early to make him think about just rumbling in on you in the way that he does, like you say. He takes his time, he's nice and loose. He's got that kind of James Toney thing going on that you described, where he's got those massive big shoulders kind of hunched, but the elbows and the hands are really loose.
Yeah.
I mean, he's... people have avoided him. People have avoided him, there's no question about it. But with the way boxing is now, they're not going to be able to avoid him for much longer. But that was a very, very painful experience for Anderson, and the kind of experience that will be difficult to explain to yourself, because maybe he can point at a few things in camp, and some of the things that I mentioned, there's a reason why that happened, because he was systematically dismantled, basically, wasn't he?
He was, but not to go into this fight too much, but the warning signs were there with Anderson. You saw it in the Charles Martin fight. Just there were times where he got hit absolutely clean, and I just remember watching that and thinking, God, if he sits in the pocket like that with Bakole, he's going to get obliterated, and that's exactly what happened. So, it was one of them. But I still feel that Anderson's got a really high ceiling in terms of the athletic ability he has as a heavyweight. I still think he can come again. That he doesn't have to. Bakole lost earlier in his career. Anderson can definitely come again, but it's like you say, it's whether he's got the sort of the psychology for it. So it'll be really interesting.
How much does he want it? It will come to that, because at that kind of level, you need to have the skill level to be able to exist at a certain level. But if you have that, then really it comes down to it's basics. But how hard are you, really? Yeah. How much are you going to learn, and how much is he going to walk away from that thinking to himself, I got well paid for that fight. Top Rank will keep me for a bit. I need to win my comeback fight, and then I can probably get another couple of big ones. But you know what? In general, fuck this. Like, that was so hard. I don't want that again. Or is he going to think to himself, okay, well, that's the reality. That's what can happen if maybe you cut a few corners, or you don't quite believe in yourself in the way that you need to, or maybe I'm not asking enough of myself in training. That is what will happen again if I don't waken up. So it could go either way. But you're right. A defeat's definitely not. It doesn't have to be fatal, but it can be.
No, and we need more American heavyweights. So I hope he comes back effectively. We'll do one more of our own, and then we'll talk about Joshua Dubois. So the last one I want to put to you is Itauma against Dempsey McKean, and I think this one actually wasn't in the DAZN video, but is on DAZN, so I can show you guys the knockout. And I think this one should have made the list. I know it was late in the year, so perhaps they'd already made the list. But I think the context of this fight, as well as the actual sort of technical nature of the knockout, a real coming out party for Moses Itauma here, because this was his first sort of big test against someone big who was a good standard, who could hit him back, potentially I should say. And he just absolutely wiped him out in one round, and sort of everybody can get as hyped about him as they want now, really, off that win. But what did you make of it, Andy?
Yeah, I was at this one as well, and it was actually on the near side of the ring, so it was right in front of me. And
wow,
just as I was watching it, Shay McGuigan, who I was working with me and Matt, he was explaining to us that it's the speed of Itauma that really is so absolutely lethal. And as he was saying it, he did what he did. A few seconds before that, he knocked him down with a similar move, but he hadn't quite got the distance right, and so he ended up kind of sandbagging him on the top of the head, which is still enough to take him down. And then for this second one, he adjusted the feet slightly, and we had a perfect side-on view of him just kind of measuring with the lead hand. It's almost like watching that lead hand, just like watching somebody like cutting the rope on a catapult, and then this left hand just comes through in this glorious shallow arc and hit him right on the chin. And credit to McKean, he didn't knock him out. It didn't knock him unconscious.
Yeah.
It put him down, and the referee was counting. And Neil Scott, the doctor I mentioned, he was already in the ring because he knows that's it. The fight has to be over at this point. And McKean's corner had thrown in the towel anyway. I don't think the referee had any intention of letting him continue. But sometimes referees want to give fighters a chance to get back to their feet, even if they know they're not going to let them go on, because it just gives them. And it was
the first round right as well.
Yeah. It at the very least, it gives them their pride that they can show people that they did get up. But then you save them by not allowing them to continue. It was just a beautiful bit of boxing and a perfectly executed punch against a fighter who'd only lost once, who was supposed to cause problems or at least take Itauma a few rounds, and he couldn't do it. But what was so impressive about it was the mechanics of it. Like the Joshua one, for me, it was the mechanics that they drill in the gym all of the time, and they make it look really easy, but it's down to fractions. You know, if his foot had been slightly further forward, his lead foot, or slightly further back, then the biting point of the punch wouldn't have been quite where it needed to be, because at impact, what you want is for the glove to make contact at 80% of full extension.
Like on the pads, right?
Yeah, that's what people will tell you, because that way you've still got that bit further to go. So 100% extension would see you basically punched through and out of the back of their head, which is what you want. You know, you need to punch through the target. And everything about it was absolutely perfect. Fractional kind of mistakes, or I say a little bit further forward, a little bit further back, and that biting point wouldn't have been quite what it was, and he wouldn't have hit him quite where he hit him. But it was perfect. I mean, it was absolutely perfect.
Yeah, no, super impressive. And I don't want to be an annoying sort of... I don't want to make an annoying comparison, because obviously, you know, any mobile heavyweight, because Usyk is the guy, you know, the mobile heavyweight, is going to get compared to him a little bit. But there was something about the way Itauma very quickly realised how redundant, and they you know, the amount of game form they do in that gym, in Ben Davison's gym, they probably knew already. But he very quickly realised how redundant the McKean lead hand was in those scenarios, because he fired over the top of it. He knew in that position McKean couldn't defend with it, and he couldn't hurt him with it. And it was a similar thing with the Usyk-Fury fight. The amount of times that Fury would sort of measure with his lead hand, and Usyk would just fire over the top of it, because he knew in that scenario Fury couldn't really do anything on that side. And to see that, the intelligence behind that knockout, it wasn't, you know, when AJ was coming through, he showed his sort of world-class ability in terms of how physical he was. He could blitz guys in that sort of mid-range. Wasn't loads of thought to it a lot of the time, but Itauma really early on just showing just really measured understanding of what's going on in front of him.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is a science, you know, because what you're looking at there is you're looking at points of impact, you're looking at angles, you're looking at trajectories, and what was so good from Usyk against Fury was the way that he would just he would dip his knees, drop his height slightly, jab to the body with his right hand, and then shoot the left hand up almost at 45 degrees, and he kept catching him with it. It's kind of like a split 1-2 almost. Punches arriving at completely different levels, one low enough that it's below your eye line, the other one shooting up into your eye line onto that radar screen late, and that's what they think about. It's fractions, you know. This is not something. No one's, to an extent, they are always winging it in there, which makes it doubly interesting, because it's you've got an opponent and you're reacting, so you can have a plan and you can have things that you think will work, but good fighters know how to adjust. But they will also have things that they feel will work. And against McKean, he was such a stand-up fighter, like a really kind of old school amateur style almost, really, to be honest, up on his toes, hands high, elbows quite far out, and Itauma's the absolute opposite of that. He's languid, he gets really, really low, and he's got that kind of elasticity to him that allowed that left hand to travel probably further than McKean thought it could, from where it was thrown from.
That's true.
It was really, really impressive to watch.
Yeah, and I think we saw it. I think was it Wack he fought before as well. Just how easily he gets in and out of range. Like, you know, just in a moment's notice, his feet are in range and he can land on you. It's super impressive.
Because he's not that tall either. But and with Wack looked like he'd seen a ghost, because he just kept getting hit with punches that he was standing there thinking, how have you done that? You were too far away, and now you're just. Now you just hit me really hard loads of times. Like, this isn't. He couldn't figure it out, and that's a really disconcerting place to find yourself in when you're that experienced, where someone's doing something to you and you can't even really work out how. Yeah,
and not to get too gassed, but I do sort of feel like when you look at, you know, we've had this sort of era of really big heavyweights, you know, Wilder, Joshua, Fury, all absolutely huge, but I do feel like Itauma's maybe that perfect heavyweight build where he's not so big that he loses speed, but he's big enough that he can compete with those bigger guys. So, and he is rapid, isn't he? He's so fast. So, So anyway, we'll move on from that one. Yeah.
Interestingly with him, just finally on him,
Yeah.
he's been around about 240 most of his fights, 240 pounds, so just above 17 stone. For that one, he was 249. And when you look at him, the last year was across the shoulders and the pecs, there's more to come. So I'd imagine he'll probably end up.
I've heard you saying that before, yeah.
Yeah, he'll probably end up at like definitely 260, but it'll all be just natural muscle. So he doesn't feel like you look at. There's a real kind of like density to his body composition. I don't know what his bone density is, but I'd imagine it's probably quite high, and that gives you heavy hands. So he'll never look absolutely massive, but actually weight-wise, he'll be pretty big.
Yeah, no, it's very exciting, and I hope they try and get him that chance to break Mike Tyson's record, because you could just, for the headlines, for the British boxing scene, it would be absolutely fantastic. But let's finally discuss the Joshua Dubois, the Dubois stoppage of Joshua, the knockout that won the Ring Magazine Knockout of the Year. And as we talk about it, if you just want to have a think about some of the other ones, Andy, that you might pick over it, or indeed, to explain why you think that's maybe one knockout of the year over some of the other ones we discussed.
I could completely understand why it's won, because you look at the stage, and again, I was lucky enough to be there for it, and it was, when you've got a big fight like that, what you want is either an amazing fight back and forth, or you want an amazing performance, and we got an amazing performance from Dubois. A key point in that fight was right at the end of the first round when he put Joshua down, and I talked about concussion earlier on. Once he dropped Joshua at the end of the first round, the writing was on the wall, really. It was going to be very, very hard for Joshua to get back into that fight because he was concussed. And people talked about some of the things he was doing in the corner, saying Dubois was shit and looking out of the ring and not seeming to really be paying attention. That's because he wasn't really in the room.
Yeah.
He didn't really know what was happening. He was. I looked at him and I just thought, you're concussed. And at that point, if you're Ben Davison, there's not all that much you can do. You're not going to pull your fighter out, but at the same time, you know that if he can't reduce Dubois to the same state, or knock him out even better, then it's just a matter of time. But then he steps in and he lands that right hand, and you see that devilish little smile kind of light up Anthony's face, and he's thinking, I can get back in this. I can get back in this. And as he's coming forward, he just gets caught by that perfectly timed short right hand. He kept his shape, Dubois, even though he'd been cracked really hard a couple of times, and people have wondered about his punch resistance and his desire to take it. Basically, he'd proven in a couple of fights before that maybe he did have the credentials for that, but that was really the eye of the storm, and he just timed him on the way in. And as soon as he went down, you knew that he wasn't going to. Looking from where I was very confident he wasn't going to be able to beat the count, but you could see that he was going to try. And that's a really dramatic kind of knockout, because it's amazing to see someone stretched out. It's an incredible spectacle. But when you see someone trying to beat the count but just unable to do it, particularly somebody as big as that, because their body just won't do what their brain is kind of half telling them to, the messages are too mixed, they're just not getting through. Again, that is equally as dramatic in many ways. And the stadium's going absolutely wild. And the adrenaline at ringside just goes through the roof at that point. And those kinds of those spells, if you do what I do, that's what you live for, really, because you see someone go down and you've got that classic boxing scenario of, can they beat the count? And then they can't, and the fight's over. And Ben Davison's running across the ring to get his gum shield out and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Do you remember the way that he tried to get up and he almost sort of ended up doing a headstand? And then I was going to ask you the way, and actually you just reminded me of it again, the way you just described it just then. Did it remind you of the Khan Prescott knockout a little bit where...
Yeah, completely, yeah, absolutely, yeah. That was the first thing that came into my mind. And I spoke to Amir about that for the book. And obviously he doesn't remember getting knocked out by Canelo because he was knocked out cold. But he does remember Prescott. Because it's funny, that one, because most people's recollections of that are that he just got completely banjoed by Prescott, knocked out cold, taken away on a stretcher, and that isn't what happened. And so he remembers it, and so that for me was a brilliant one, and he gave me an amazing description of it, where he just said, getting knocked down like that, he gave me this vivid description of it. And the key line was, it's like a jigsaw puzzle that goes smash, and you're trying to put all the bits back together in under 10 seconds.
Yeah.
That's what you're trying to do. And it was just, I was standing there just listening to him talk to me about it, and I just thought, wow, that is so good. That's such a good description. And that's what Joshua was trying to do, and he just couldn't quite do it. You think about Mike Tyson fumbling around for his mouthpiece against James Buster Douglas again. Muscle memory and instinct tells him, I've got to get back to my feet. I've got to get back to my feet. But he didn't even really know where he was. He got back to his feet, walked back to his corner, and he asked his corner, Jay Bright and Aaron Snow, what happened? And they said to him, you got counted out, champ. Because that short-term memory just wasn't there. But in a way it was, because he knew what he was expected to do in that scenario. And it's the same with Joshua. You know, he's on the canvas, and his instinct is just get up, try and get up. And he just couldn't quite do it.
So if I was to press you to pick one, including the one that they picked, the Dubois knockout of Joshua, which would be your knockout of 2024?
I think because of the magnitude of the occasion and the spectacle and all the rest of it, I can understand why they picked Dubois, and I think it would feel a bit churlish not to give it to him, to be honest, because it was at Wembley Stadium, and I thought that was I made Joshua a favourite, but not by much. You know, I thought Dubois was a very live underdog in that fight. I think a wider sporting audience just didn't really give him any chance at all. So yeah, I think all things considered, it would be pretty mean-spirited not to give it to him. But for the pure mechanics, I loved Joshua's. I loved Joshua's against Ngannou. Yeah, it's those two. You know, AJ's involved in both of them. You know, and that's fascinating in itself. That in the space of a year, that's the business they're in. In the space of a year, he finds himself on both sides of the coin.
Exactly.
I mean, that is the life they have to lead. You know,
that's heavyweights, isn't it?
That's heavyweight boxing. It's crazy. It is the roll of a dice. He said that to us during the week, Anthony. You know, that's what this sport is. It's a roll of a dice, and it really is that. Because he went out and he started brilliantly against Ngannou, and he did what he did. He went out and he started poorly against Dubois, and what happened. You know, and on any given night, they never really know what's going to happen. They just don't, and they have to find a way of being okay with it.
Yeah, and ironically, that was literally what he said right before he went out and got stopped. He said, roll the dice. They were telling him, roll the dice. He said, roll the dice. And
they had to. They had to. You know, he got a bit of criticism, Ben Davison, partly because Shane McGuigan, who was working for Five Live, just called what happened so accurately. It made it look like it made it sound like the worst advice in the world. But
I know.
And from a technical standpoint, you know, Shane knows much better than me. Maybe it wasn't the wisest policy to advise him on which those particular punches to try and throw. But as I said previously, after he'd been buzzed and concussed at the end of round one, he wasn't really capable of taking on too much information. There wasn't really all that much that Ben Davison can do in that scenario, other than just say, look, we've got to land something. Because I don't think they'd have let that go on that much longer, you know. I think if he'd had a rough round that round but not got knocked out, I think Ben Davison might have said to him, I'll give you one more, and if I don't see something, I'm going to stop it. Yeah,
well, ironically, I think if I'm going to choose one, the one I just have to choose is Wardley Clarke 2, and I know it's not a pure knockout, but I don't think I'm ever going to forget that. I think that's how I kind of judge it, and I think I've never seen a knockout like that before. I couldn't
nor have I.
Stop it. It was so shocking, and ironically, Ben Davison on the other side of the side of the victory, and again, you talked about the unfortunate sort of nature of Shane calling that so perfectly, but when this one, there was a great shot of Wardley on the pads you'll seen it with Ben before the fight, showing him put your jab out, pull his hand down, shoot your right hand over the top, and he did exactly that to get that whole sequence of events in action. So for me, I don't think I've ever been quite so shocked when someone's been stopped. And I mean shocked not in terms of Wardley winning. I mean shocked in terms of what actually happened. I was like, bloody hell, that is absolutely horrific. So
I agree with you. And just looking at it, we were the same. We were trying to work out in real time what's actually happened here, because that when the camera went in on him, when he's kind of kneeling next to the ropes, and there's a slight displacement of the jaw and the dent and the look of utter bewilderment and kind of genuine, almost fear / concern, confusion in his eyes. It is amazing how many words a picture can speak sometimes, isn't it? And just someone's eyes sometimes can tell you an awful lot about what's going on inside their head. It was shocking. It really was. I've not seen one like that before. We've seen people, I mentioned Dubois taking a knee against Joe Joyce, and he had a fractured eye socket, but we couldn't see that. Kell Brook, same thing. We couldn't really see it. Whereas with that, you're just like, wow, there's actually a dent in the side of his face.
I know. Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah. Andy, listen, thank you so much for all the time you give me today. We've done over an hour. But before we go, you must plug your very good book. For everyone listening to this, you'll notice that Andy knows a weird amount about men being rendered unconscious.
It's true, I do.
Book. But yeah, plug the book in the best way that you can. To try and get
I wrote this last year, and the knockout sport's most decisive moment, and it's basically about the knockout and why it's this incredibly dramatic moment in sport and why no other sport has anything like it. And I speak to a lot of people about what's it like to knock somebody out, what's it like to get knocked out, how do you get over it, the mental aspect of it, the mental aspect really of living that life where you're not just a boxer, but you're boxing in a particular way where it's you or him, it's you or her, one of you's getting knocked out. That's what you're going in the ring to do, and you have to accept, or at least it's better if you do, that it could happen to you. And how do you walk that line? And I've got some great stuff from the likes of Carl Froch, Tony Bellew, Amir Khan, Ricky Hatton, David Hay, Deontay Wilder, Matt McKean, Jamie Moore, Fabio's in it, Fabio Wardley. Before he had the first fight against Fraser, actually, had to finish it at the start of that year. Anthony Yard, he was really interesting. Lots of trainers as well about the responsibility of, when do you pull a fighter out, because you've got to expose them to the danger of it. If you want them to do well, you have to accept the fact that they could get knocked out, and how heavily that weighs with them. Referees too, like when do you stop a fight, when do you not stop a fight. I loved it. I'm not sure I'll ever find a subject again as interesting as I found this one. Which is what you need when you're writing a book, because you don't want to get halfway through and then realise that actually you're a bit bored of it. That's happened to people I know, and that would be a terrible feeling.
And as uncovered as well. I mean, it was curious. You've obviously gone and approached this subject and this topic, and you've gone into it, and you I think you've almost realised, probably before you started, but as I was listening to it, I started thinking, no one's really talked about knockouts like this before.
No, I think I'd read quite a lot of stuff where people would talk to someone about how do you get over a knockout and all that kind of stuff. But I think people were maybe a bit worried about asking them. And then I kind of tested it out on people I know. So I know Matt really well, Matt McKean. He got knocked out by Jamie Moore, and he was just very matter of fact. He just said, "Look, it's not like it's boxing. It's what happens. It's nothing to be. No one's ashamed of getting chinned. It's what happens." And they were all like that. They were all fine talking about it. And Amir was in particular, when I didn't have long with him, I kind of pounced on him in Saudi, and he half knew what I wanted to talk about, and I said, "So can we talk about Prescott knockout, or I might start with Canelo? What do you remember?" And he kind of went into a little bit of autopilot. Well, it was my first defeat, and obviously it was difficult to get over. And I said, no, like right in the moment in the ring, what do you remember? And he said, "Oh wow, like." Yeah. Oh, okay. And like I say, he gave me this great stream of consciousness, but I got the impression that no one had ever really asked him.
Yeah.
Because I can understand why you might think, I don't know if...
Seems a bit off limits, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it does. But having said that, the only active fighters I got were ones who haven't been knocked out. Anthony Yard got stopped by Kovalev and by Beterbiev. Tunde stopped the fight against Beterbiev. He did get knocked out against Kovalev because he would have been counted out, so it was a knockout, but he wasn't laid out.
You got Wilder, though. Wilder would have been active.
I did get Wilder, but I didn't really go there in depth. I talked about it in general terms. Talking to someone, an active fighter, in real depth, and getting them to be really honest, I don't think would really be possible. And that's why I got great stuff from Anthony and Fabio, but in general I knew that if a fighter is retired, then they're going to be they're just able to be a lot more honest in a way
Yeah.
that they can't be if they're fighting.
All part of becoming a civilian. Andy, thank you so much for your time today. Guys, if you've enjoyed this interview, please go and get Andy's book. I'll put some links in the description so you can do that. Audio book, Andy narrates it, and hardback copy. And please subscribe to the channel if you've enjoyed this. Get your comments in below, like the video. And Andy, again, thank you so much for your time, mate.
No problem.